So I guess the EU has finally realized the value of the US domestic market, by far the most expensive and profitable market in the world. After so many rounds of talks and back and forth, the US and European Union have now signed a mega trade deal. And honestly, this is one of the biggest trade deals ever struck between two major players. Let's break it down in simple terms. How the European Union, arguably the world's largest economic bloc, got outmaneuvered in trade negotiations by US President Donald Trump. To understand how big this deal is, just look at the numbers. The European Union is America's largest trading partner. In 2024 alone, the US and EU exchanged goods worth nearly $976 billion. That's massive. In fact, the US and EU have the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world. But here's the problem. That trade relationship is nowhere near balanced for the US. The US runs a $235 billion trade deficit with the EU. Yeah, $235 billion. That's no small number. So, to address this massive trade gap, President Trump has now locked in a deal that's heavily tilted in America's favor. He's even calling it the biggest deal ever made. Now, to be clear, this isn't a full-blown trade agreement yet. It's a framework, but a major one. As part of this framework, President Trump announced a flat 15% tariff on most EU imports, including cars, pharmaceuticals, and semiconductors. And just to remind you, this isn't a deal with one country. The European Union is a body of 27 nations. So yeah, the US just struck a trade deal with all 27 European countries. Even US Vice President J.D. Vance joked about the media, saying they'll now write, Donald Trump only got 99.9% of what he asked for. And here's the kicker. The EU agreed to put zero tariffs on US goods coming into Europe. Zero. Nada. It was like they just rolled over. And the way the deal was signed, it screamed dominance. Trump went to Scotland, publicly scolded EU leaders over illegal immigration, spent some time at his own golf resort, Trump Turnberry, and had the EU head come to him to finalize the deal. That's a power move if I've ever seen one. And just think, not long ago, the EU was threatening counter-tariffs on US goods. Now, tables have completely turned. Even Ursula von der Leyen has now admitted that US-EU trade was never balanced. Oh, and another wild part of this deal. EU steel and aluminum will still face a 50% tariff when sold into the US. That hasn't changed. So how does this benefit the US? Well, look, from now onward you'll see a major hike in American exports to the EU. For example, you're going to see a huge increase in US agricultural exports to Europe. More soybeans, corn, and processed food from the US hitting European markets. And this will hit European farmers hard, especially in countries like France, Ireland, and Poland. Then there is LNG and energy. The US is already one of the biggest exporters of liquefied natural gas, LNG, and now the EU has agreed to increase purchases. This is part of their effort to move away from Russian energy since the Ukraine crisis. In defense also, U.S. arms manufacturers like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon are going to benefit big time. The EU has committed to raising defense spending, and a lot of that will go toward buying American weapons. Also, while not directly written into the deal, President Trump has been pressuring the EU to relax digital regulations. This benefits big U.S. tech firms, especially as they resist new EU laws on data privacy, online speech, and taxation. Now, U.S. car manufacturers could also benefit from this, if Europeans really like U.S. cars. I mean, the U.S. makes big cars which may be unusual for European people, like pickup trucks, Jeep, Tesla, Cadillac, and many more. But if Europeans get hooked on U.S. car companies, then all U.S. car companies can make billions of dollars from the European market. And here's another massive piece of the deal. The EU has agreed to purchase $750 billion worth of U.S. energy over 3 years. That's $250 billion per year in LNG, oil, and even nuclear fuel, all sourced from the U.S. Von der Leyen confirmed this is part of their shift away from Russian energy. And it's kind of ironic. Remember that old Trump speech where he warned the EU not to depend on Russian energy? And European leaders literally laughed? Well, Nobody's laughing now. And there's more. The EU has pledged an additional $600 billion in investments into the U.S. economy, which is going to create tons of new jobs and opportunities. We're talking about infrastructure, energy systems, communication networks, all areas that are going to benefit. Altogether, European countries will be investing around $1.35 trillion into the U.S. in the near future. That's insane. And it's going to make U.S.-EU economic ties stronger than ever, at least from the American side. But what did Europe get in return? Honestly, not much. No full tariff rollback. No clear relief for key industries. No long-term peace on trade. Before this deal, the U.S. had an average tariff of just 1.6% on EU goods. Now, it's nearly 10 times that. Basically, the EU agreed to President Trump's terms to avoid something worse. They blinked. They suspended their own planned tariffs and sat down to negotiate, but under serious pressure. And the EU's internal divisions were obvious. Germany wanted to protect its auto industry. Ireland was worried about beef and pharma, and France had its own economic concerns. They got fought back. They had tools, a 93 billion euros retaliatory package, and even the anti-coercion instrument, but they just didn't act fast or unified enough. President Trump played hardball. While EU leaders followed the rulebook, Trump treated this like a New York street fight. And it worked. Also, geopolitics played a big role. Many EU members feared retaliation beyond trade. President Trump had already hinted at pulling troops from Europe and cutting weapons supplies to Ukraine. With NATO unity on the line, Brussels treaded cautiously. Some experts believe that had the EU stood with China in April, when markets were panicking, it could have forced President Trump into a better deal. Instead, the bloc's hesitation and internal disagreements led to a deal that one diplomat called a capitulation. Now, if we talk about reactions to this deal, then the Irish PM welcomed the deal, but admitted that bilateral trade will now face more challenges. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz, whose country is the EU's biggest trading partner with the U.S., praised the deal as a way to avoid a trade war. Volkswagen has even pledged huge U.S. investments and is hoping to strike a separate deal with Trump. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni was more cautious. She said she wants to see the fine print before celebrating. Now, let's look at this from a geopolitical lens. The U.S. is simultaneously negotiating with China, South Korea, and Brazil. Tariffs on these countries could be as high as 50%. President Trump has clearly adopted a strategy of economic leverage, threatening tariffs to force better terms. In fact, President Trump has stated that a deal with China is also very close. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is set to meet Chinese officials in Stockholm to finalize a potential agreement before the August 12th deadline. Now, if I conclude this deal then, this deal gives the U.S. better export access, more geopolitical leverage, and totally expose the cracks within the EU. It's not just a trade deal. It's a big sign of how global diplomacy is changing and how pressure politics is now the new normal. So, what do you think about this trade deal? Do you think it's really a win for the U.S., or is it more of a balanced deal? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching. Hope you all have a great day.